We're here, we're live. Welcome to the Thinking About Computers podcast, where we talk about thinking about computers. Our guest today, Parker Ziegler, a third-year PhD student at Berkeley, working on programming languages and human-computer interaction with Sarah Chasin. Parker lived many lives before coming to grad school, worked at multiple companies as a software engineer before grad school, spent 5 years roughly in industry, and before that did his bachelor's degree in cartography and Arabic, not computer science. So excited to hear all about that. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Take two on the pod.
Yeah,
doubly excited to be here this time. Yeah.
So, why Arabic?
Yeah.
Why geography?
Yeah. So I went to college at this tiny liberal arts college, Middlebury College in northern Vermont, and the college is really focused on language programs. It's kind of one of the few undergraduate institutions, at least at the time, that had like a 4-year Arabic program. And I had started Arabic my last year of high school. I grew up in a small town in Western Massachusetts, and we had a college nearby that would allow the high schoolers to come and take classes. So I did my first year of Arabic at the end of high school, and was just pretty convinced that I wanted to follow a path as an interpreter and spend time in the Middle East, do some work in international aid, refugee studies kind of stuff. So decided to really go the full path of studying Arabic and trying to become an interpreter. And then about 3.5 years into doing that at Middlebury, I kind of figured out that wasn't totally the path that I wanted to follow. I did also study abroad and live in Jordan for about 4 months. And I think it was then that I kind of realized, living halfway around the world from my friends and family was something I couldn't really do full time. But Middlebury was also where I kind of discovered geography as a discipline. And I had this amazing undergraduate advisor, Casey McKinney, who kind of converted me and many, many other students like me to geography students. And then also Jeff Howarth, who was my first cartography professor. I actually didn't get started with map making and cartography until about year 3 in the geography major. So kind of a late bloomer in all ways. Didn't even start programming until the last year of undergrad. And when I started programming, it was really because I was focused on kind of interactive cartography and map making, and kind of fell backwards into Leaflet and D3 and kind of the whole world of web mapping, mostly just to kind of continue my education in cartography. And then the more time I spent programming, the more I was like, oh, maybe I just really like programming. So yeah, very, very circuitous kind of 4 years through undergrad, where I just kind of kept chasing different interests, kind of where they led. Programming is probably the thing that has stuck the longest in my life. Is something I've been continually interested in.
What's the I somewhat thought cartography was a dying profession. Is it?
I think it's not really a dying profession. I think it's more just a shifting profession with shifting media underneath it. So I think kind of maybe the era of print cartography kind of feels, a little bit niche. I think most people's relationships to maps are I don't know, I get a lot of my family had this atlas and I loved looking at it in the back seat, or oh, there's this one map I saw that I just thought was so beautiful. They're aesthetic artifacts, I think, for a lot of people. I'm everyone is oh, I have this map. Do you want it? I just have a drawer filled with people's, maps that they've given me. So they're Parker, you're the map guy.
You love these things.
Yeah. And then I think there's kind of been a rising interest in the data journalism community and how do we do representation of phenomena in the world across space and at scale. And maps are still kind of the, I think, best visual form we have for communicating how phenomena vary across time and space. That's kind of where they really shine. And there's a lot of great, like, really interesting visualization theory from Jacques Bertin and Leland Wilkinson and all of the kind of big folks in kind of the big textbooks that all of the Viz students read. They really talk a lot about like maps kind of like unique place in showing kind of particular kinds of data. So I think there's a big angle now where it's kind of becoming a core skill for data journalists in the newsroom. Obviously, Earth and climate scientists are like starting to do things like develop these like massive, gigantic climate models that are trying to predict how global weather and climate phenomena are going to evolve and vary across time. That involves a lot of mapping, and then the entire kind of like Earth observation industry. Now, a lot of that is like USGS or NASA trying to kind of understand either local or large scale kind of phenomena, mostly through satellite imagery and remote sensing. Obviously, there's like kind of the other arm to this, which is like folks who do like defense surveillance, that kind of monitoring. Definitely doing the intersection of geography and Arabic in undergrad and like cartography in particular was like, I think I was maybe like prime recruiting candidate for like the CIA or the NSA.
They didn't
try
and get you though.
We did always have folks from like the FBI and CIA come to like give kind of like an info session on a career with the FBI that I always thought was kind of funny. It seemed like they were always kind of barking up the wrong tree with the students taking care of it. But yeah, so I think like now we're kind of moving into this really exciting era where a lot of people have data with some kind of spatial component attached to it. All the papers on kind of geospatial data love to be like X percentage of the world's data has like a spatial component. People love to like reference that. Those numbers always feel a little like hand wavy to me, but you can think about, everything kind of happens somewhere. So most data does have kind of a location component. And as data grows in scale, there's also just lots of challenges of like, how do we efficiently represent that data at that kind of scale in a way that people can actually digest. So I think that's a big part of my research, is kind of focusing a lot on how do we make it easier to work with like gigantic scale geospatial data for people who don't have like expert programming backgrounds. That's really kind of like the core kind of area I'm getting into. And I think data journalists have been like a particular class of users that I've worked a lot with, mostly because they have a lot of spatial data. They're trying to use it to communicate something to the public. And a lot of them have like some degree of programming skill, but it can kind of vary from like people who are like experts in every front end framework are like writing web GPU code by hand. They're super smart, way smarter than me, to like folks who've never opened an IDE. So it's thinking about like, how do we serve this kind of class of people with such dynamic kind of programming capabilities? Yeah, I'm super interested in that. And I think journalists are rad and cool.
Yeah.
That's super compelling. And so you, in your PhD research, work with real people with real problems, which is kind of unusual. A lot of computer science
surprisingly.
PhDs.
Yeah. I think, when I first came into grad school, I've been doing a lot of work at my previous job on like open source libraries, mostly in like the React, Node.js, kind of GraphQL, ReasonML ecosystems. And I think I was really like hooked on that kind of feeling you have when the tools you use are getting adopted by people and used by people. We really benefited from like the company having kind of a name brand in the open source community in our kind of area. And so if we did release a new library, it was kind of like hype alone could get us to 1,000 stars and 100,000 NPM downloads in not too much time. and that feeling was like really exhilarating to me. And then when I came to, Berkeley, I had like all of these ideas essentially for just like how to continue some of that work.
Mm-hmm.
And my advisor was kind of like, maybe NPM downloads alone are not like the perfect metric for understanding kind of like impact of your work and adoption. And she was the one who suggested, let's take the first year to do really in-depth user research with kind of a class of programmers that you're interested in working with. And let's just try to identify like what is hard about programming for this group of people right now. And I was honestly very resistant to doing it. I think I was like, okay, my advisor, she knows what she's doing. I should just like take her word for it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think doing like deep qualitative research with human subjects like that, when you come from a background where you're used to like spending 6 to 8 hours a day in your editor and like publishing new releases of your library and shipping features, like I was definitely getting like very antsy about it. But the flip side was that like I learned way more about how people use and struggle to use computational tools than like I ever did in 5 years of kind of just being focused on building. And I think I really like, it took a while to come around to it, but I think after about 1.5 years, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so happy I did this study, because it essentially just created fertile ground for, okay, here's 8 to 9 directions for new research to go in. With like clear motivations for particular systems that could address like real needs that real people have in their work. So now, all the junior PhD students, I'm like, I think you should spend your first year, doing in-depth qualitative research on a problem you care about to kind of set out the problem space. And, in HCI, I think that kind of work lends itself very nicely to kind of a first paper where you get to kind of like, in some ways, like, delimit kind of a space that you're going to work in for a few years. And then every paper that you write afterwards gets to kind of refer back to prior work you've done. Like, you almost never have to write a motivation section again, because you're like, well, this prior work actually showed that this is like a huge gap for this class of programmers. So I think in that way, it's a really great way to start. But I think it is fairly unorthodox for most folks outside of HCI to kind of start that way. But now it's just nice to basically never have like that, like, geez, what am I going to work on? Like, if anything, I have like more problems to work on than I have time to work on. So
that's super interesting. That's so different than like anyone else's first year of their PhD that I've heard from.
Yeah, I think that's really like that's really common to Sarah's group. So Justin Lubin, another PhD student in the lab, he spent most of his first year doing a type of qualitative research called grounded theory, which is like even more kind of rigorous than what I did. I did a method called contextual inquiry, also very rigorous, but grounded theory is kind of like, I consider it like top hard mode of qualitative methods.
Okay.
And essentially did like an incredibly in-depth study on like, how do functional programmers code? Like, if we're going to like kind of figure out or discern like what an approach to functional programming is, like, how do experts do it? And then, how can we use those lessons to essentially inform the design of new functional languages? He's like gone in a totally different direction now, where he does PL for, wet lab biologists and experimental biologists. But he's using the same approach of essentially having spent, in his case, like over a year, a lab with experimental biologists at Berkeley, and like accumulating knowledge to kind of figure out what a unified programming system to address their needs would be. So I think most people in Sarah's group kind of like are kind of on that path. And I think it's a really like cool path. But definitely your first year, you're like, rewatching 1.5 hour like observations that you did. You're like, oh, I'm tired. Like, yeah.
Yeah, it's super compelling. I mean, like a lot of branches of computer science, like maybe someone like had an experience with a user did sort of a study like this at some point, but like for years and years, people have kind of like leveraged that in intros and like made arguments like that are like kind of like, I don't know, a layer of indirection every time, like
laundering motivation.
And so you just you read intros that like have exactly opposite kind of motivating claims, and they're just claims. There's no kind of users at the bottom of it, like studies. So I find that very cool and feels very scientific compared to like, I don't know, other approaches, I guess.
Yeah, that's cool to hear. I think, like anytime you're doing qualitative methods in computer science, I think it's just so kind of like young in our field that I think we're still learning like kind of what place does it have. And I think, within HCI, it's been very established, but even HCI researchers are, we're kind of just doing what like anthropologists, sociologists, geographers, like all of these social scientists have kind of broke ground on the methods, and then we're kind of taking the methods and applying them to better understand humans' relationships with computing. And now, I think what we're seeing in Sarah's group with this kind of PL HCI combination that we're trying to do is like more of the programming languages venues are starting to actually want to see this kind of qualitative work, whether to motivate, contributions or as evaluation, right? If we introduce some new kind of language or abstraction or an embedded DSL, like how do we actually make claims about, does this help people program?
Right.
Right? How do we do that like rigorously? And I think for a long time, it was kind of like, I don't know, like a lot of papers would essentially be like, look how many fewer lines of code it is to express this idea in our DSL than an existing implementation in C++ or C or whatever. And then there's like, big questions there about like, are these lines of code like a good metric for complexity? And like, if you do write a DSL to like tackle a problem, like what about the entire language ecosystem around it? Like, do you have a type checker for it, or like editor extensions and a language server? And I think like now with qualitative methods, we're actually at a point where we can like start to talk about some of those claims of like what makes a programming language good for people. Yeah. But we're kind of like just starting to get there and trying to figure out how to do that as a field. So it's exciting times in PL, I think. Definitely feels like there's kind of a sea change with people being really interested in human factors. And then, of course, like LLMs are also very much coming for PL in a similar vein. But
I guess, sorry, I feel like I always bring up LLMs, but mainly because I deal with them too much. But do you think this focus on like how do humans interact with computers, at least I know in like the machine learning space, like people were pretty anti-human studies. Like it was like, if you could avoid a human study, like you were going to do it. And people came up with a ton of like indirect metrics of like, how can I measure this so I don't need humans? Yeah. But with like LLMs and other generative models, I feel like it's almost gone the other way to where people are like, okay, like we do need people. And I assume for programming languages, like, the way a user would interact with like GPT to help with programming, I'm sure is very different than a user who like understands the code really well, like understands libraries. Like it seems like almost like a completely different beast that the ML community doesn't really touch too much of like, how do humans interact with this?
Yeah.
I don't know. We only care about like, if you can correctly identify your problem, if we can solve it well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's kind of like two like areas in which like LLMs and NPL are kind of like starting to intersect. I think the one you kind of mentioned around like human programmer interaction, human LLM interaction for programming, human programmer interaction. Yeah, I think that first angle is very much like how does programmer behavior kind of like change when an LLM is involved. And there's been some like very recent work on this. I think like some folks like Michael Koblenz at UCSD and his PhD student, Michael James, I think. Yeah, I think I've seen like a few studies kind of come out that are kind of interested in like, how does this change things like task decomposition or like API boundaries, right? Essentially, what is like having an LLM there? And I think there is also some work on like novice programmers, CS education angle. And then there's kind of like, what role do traditional PL techniques have to play with LLM generated code? So this is like, how do we apply program analysis techniques to like verifying semantic correctness of LLM generated code, or like this idea of neurosymbolic program synthesis, where, we have, code being generated by an LLM kind of probabilistically, and then we have like kind of formal specifications for program behavior, and how do we kind of like unify those things together? And I think that's a really interesting angle, and there's some awesome grad students here at Berkeley who are really like kind of tackling this problem of how do we bring in kind of all of the good PL techniques of old to kind of, in some ways, like solve the last mile program of like, generated code, doesn't really match a user's intent, maybe in the way that they expect. Intent is something like people working on program synthesis have thought about for a really long time. Like, how do we like ensure that code does what we want it to do?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's the angle that a lot of PL researchers are starting to take. And I'm encouraged to see that there's kind of a like, maybe like some degree of acceptance that like, hey, people are using LLMs to program. Not necessarily everyone, and the degree to which they use it, I think is something we're still figuring out. Will Creighton, who is a postdoc at Brown right now, and I think he's going to be faculty somewhere soon. He had this great tweet a while ago about like LLMs for a lot of people kind of function as like semi-context aware, like super powered autocomplete.
Yeah.
And I'm like, once I saw that, I was like, that is exactly my relationship with these things. Like I almost never am like prompting an LLM for a problem, but I'm like, that suggestion is like saves me some typing, and it's like 90% of the way to what I want. But yeah, I'm definitely encouraged to see that PL seems to be kind of taking a stance of like, this has a role to play for some people, and we're just trying to figure out like, how can we take decades of really good work that we've done and ensure that it can contribute back to making generated code better. And then I think there are definitely folks in PL who also feel like they just want kind of nothing to do with LLMs, or that they're kind of like hastening this movement away from kind of like formal deterministic ways of kind of reasoning about programs to very like squishy probabilistic ways that sometimes make people feel a little like, like our values are being lost.
Right.
Yeah, lots of differing opinions. And, I think there's also just some people who are like, they are bad. Yeah.
Where do you fall on the spectrum?
I think personally, I just tend to be like, in some ways, like very like cautious, kind of adopting a sort of wait and see approach. I think the general like tenor in my group has been like, there are a lot of problems to solve in the space of making programming better. And LLMs are kind of one technique to do that, but there's like a lot of other techniques and a lot of things we can do with interfaces that could also potentially make the experience of programming a lot better. And I think we tend to be like, let's explore this whole set of techniques, paired with kind of like domain experts who have like their own mental models for how they reason about programs. I think more recently, because I've been doing work with data journalists and just finished up this like 2-month collaboration working in a newsroom in Seattle on this big piece, like I've kind of seen firsthand the ways that people are like starting to use LLMs to code in that context. And I've kind of seen like how excited some of those people have been about it and how much it's made them feel like very empowered. And I don't necessarily think it's like, oh, like this is the only tool that could empower these folks to feel like they're programming. Like, I think there are a lot of others. But I think once I, saw that, I was a little bit like, regardless of my personal feelings, these tools are being adopted by users that I care about building for. And so I just can't like ignore the fact that they're like useful tools for people for particular tasks. That's kind of where I fall. Very like measured.
I feel like, yeah.
Where do you two fall?
Well, as someone who does research with large language models,
I feel like your talk at the Epic got like a lot of people were really pumped. I definitely feel like the crowd was like, I don't know, the industry crowd I think was very kind of LLM oriented, and I feel like they were like, yes.
Yeah, I felt very weird giving that talk because I
thought it was great.
Oh, I mean, thank you. Yeah, I was like, this is a group of like, and it always feels weird giving a presentation where you're like, LLMs, like large models, that's all we use, and it solves things that would otherwise be like people doing it. It feels like it's often a very touchy area, and I think that, also take somewhat of a measured view to this. When it comes to programming, I don't know. I definitely fall pretty heavily on the like, there are multiple ways to make a programmer's experience better. I would bet quite a large amount of money that LLMs will be that thing, at least for the next like few years. And I could be wrong, but I think it would take like quite a drastic shift from how people program now to get people to prefer that. That being said, I think that there will be people who have been programming for 10 years who are like, absolutely not. I will not adopt this technology. But yeah, like, and also LLMs I feel like are like, at least code generation models are really built for the sort of stuff that I do. I mean, like I program machine learning frameworks. LLMs are pretty good at this because there's quite a user bias. But like I use LLMs for code. I was just using it today. I was building a UI and I'm like, I don't want to learn Gradio or whatever. And have just been continuously reprompting GPT until I was like, yep, that's correct. That's it. Which, yeah. So
yeah, I think it's so funny to me to see kind of like what percentage of kind of like LLM code generation demos seem to be kind of like UI related. Like I think as someone who did like deep kind of like front end web application engineering for 5 years, like that is stuff that I love doing. And it's kind of funny that it seems to be held up as the like this onerous task that like I don't want to do.
Yeah.
And people are like, oh, look at how well this thing does on kind of like front end code. And I always feel like I always feel like I personally have like anytime I use one to kind of work on something that I'm working on, I pretty quickly I'm like, let me take the reins. Let me just kind of but
yeah, I think they've already had a big impact. Like the question is, I guess, will they plateau or have they plateaued, or like how far will it go? Like how good will like verification in the loop sort of stuff get? But I get that same feeling of like, oh, like it makes it easier to do this task I don't want to do. Like amazing, love LLMs. So when someone's like, oh yeah, they're gonna replace like people needing to prove theorems, I'm like, wait a second, that doesn't sound so good.
Yeah, I am the one doing. I didn't realize till today that you are like kind of like really loved formal reasoning stuff, or at least Joe implied that.
Yeah, I do a mix of theory and systems. Yeah, it's a fun time.
But it's interesting because I feel like LLMs have in some ways helped me learn to program better, and that it also just generally do research better, and that you really need to know what you want to get your code to work with an LLM. Same with research, of like doing research with LLMs. Like you really need to define like, this is the task and like this is the output, which I personally sometimes I'll just start coding. I'm like, yeah, I want to merge these two data frames, or like I want to like something like simple task. But then I'm like 2 hours in, and then I'm like, oh wait, this isn't exactly what I wanted. Like within the context of my task, this was not the desired output.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like a big thread of my research, speaking about this like idea of intent and how we communicate intent to computers. Like I personally get really, really excited about direct manipulation systems. Yeah. So definitely a big area in human-computer interaction, visualization too. But you know, my like I think stance kind of more recently on this has been like for certain classes of tasks, and especially visual tasks, or a case where like a visual output like a user interface or a map is kind of a desired thing, that direct manipulation interfaces can just be like so useful for kind of like dealing with the intent problem, right? If I'm specifying like a data graphic that I want to like run in a story, like describing that graphic in natural language is like, it's so fuzzy. But being able to actually like work on that thing in the context of, you know, Illustrator or like a system that I'm working on right now, like the intent is pretty much like clear because you are just directly manipulating the output. And so like a big part of my research has been like, how do we pair direct manipulation interfaces with deterministic code generation so that we allow people to write programs essentially by like modifying the output and then generating the corresponding program from kind of direct manipulation. So this is not a new idea. Like people have kind of in the last decade been working on this problem of what we call like output directed programming or programming by direct manipulation. But yeah, I think for visual inputs, it ends up being a really like interesting kind of, I don't know, other way of thinking about the intent problem. And then I don't know if you all know TL Draw or have heard of, you know, it's essentially I mean, it's a very cool company with like so many people I really admire, but it's also like an infinite canvas, kind of like drawing application, diagramming. Those were at least the initial use cases. And then they started pairing it with GPT-4 Vision. And they had this one demo, it was called like Make It Real, where you would essentially, you know, diagram, draw UI, select it, hit the Make It Real button. Wow. And then it would do code generation for, you know, that UI that you had like drawn.
Wow, that's a really good name for that as well.
Yeah. It kind of like broke like my Twitter for a day.
Yeah.
And I think that was a moment where I was like, this feels like it's getting at intent specification for like visual tasks. Right, it's still not as deterministic as like a true direct manipulation interface. But the flip side is like a direct manipulation interface, like the stuff I'm working on, is like, you know, very dedicated system programming for a long time. And as you're like adding features, right, you're always having to think about like how does an interaction in the interface map to the generated code. So it takes a long time to like implement. And when I saw that demo, I was kind of like, I'm definitely having my mind a little bit more opened to like, oh, maybe code generation from like diagrams or, you know, equations, something like that, where you're like, there's some really great stuff at WIST last fall kind of about this too, of like, you know, kind of using VR and inline mathematical equations, being able to like draw on them to alter things and see an output. It's like, yeah, we're starting to move into like the world where I think some of that stuff is becoming possible, and that's really exciting. So.
It's hilarious you mentioned that example because literally 5 minutes before we started filming this, I did exactly that of like I was building this UI and I was like, God damn it. All right, so I want this box here. Like I drew it out and then I like fed it into GPT.
Yeah.
I got a syntax error, but you know, we'll see you with some more prompting.
Yep, there's that element of it.
Yeah. So you work with these journalists and do these user studies, And to me, the hardest like barrier to doing that sort of stuff seems like where do you find these people? How do you convince them to like spend their time talking to you?
I'm so glad you asked this question, because like this is kind of like my like hill to die on with user studies. So I think the first thing is that I think there's like one way of doing user studies, especially like evaluative user studies, where the paper deadline is approaching and we're like, we need like 20 undergrads stat to like test this thing in a week so that we can like have results. For me, I like really was like, I want to work with practicing data journalists who have like concrete work right now they're doing. Recruiting for a study like that took me from October of the first year of my PhD, like after my IRB had gotten approved, until March.
Wow.
So it took 5 months to recruit all of the participants. So like, if you have, a desire to see like real work happening, it takes one, like very long. Two, I think you like really need to communicate to them back what like the value, if any, is going to be of your research. I think sometimes we're like, of course, people want to work with us. We're like researchers at Berkeley. And I'm like, no, like there's a cost to working with us. And even an hour and a half of someone's time, when you're giving them a $40 Amazon gift card or whatever, like that's not enough for a lot of people, especially for a community like data journalists where like they're really busy. So there kind of needs to be like some other premise of a relationship, or people just need to be like really curious about the stuff that you're doing. Yeah. I also had a lot of help. So like, I need to shout out Rachel Levin at the Center for College. Can't remember if it's college or center, but I think it's College of Computing, Data Science, and Society. Yes, college. But
CDSS.
Yes.
Yes.
CDSS, yes. Yeah. But
that's what it stands for.
Sarah put me in touch with her, and she had been in the journalism world and had a lot of connections, and worked with me on essentially like crafting a pitch around like participating in this study, what it would lead to. And that was super helpful. So through that, I was able to get participants from the Washington Post, LA Times, KQED, Cal Matters. Like I got to see like newsrooms like doing stuff. That being said, like even then, journalists were still pretty cagey about kind of sharing kind of in progress work with me. This was pretty hard to do. And of course, like in journalism, like while you're working on stuff, like even if it's like, I'm a researcher covered by an IRB, this video recording is living on like an encrypted drive, like people are very nervous about showing you in progress stuff because they don't want to open the newsroom up to kind of any sort of liability or themselves. So getting that kind of access, I think, was like really very hard. So sometimes too, a lot of journalists would be like, I always wanted to do this extension to this project, and that's low stakes, so I'm going to work on that, and you can observe me doing that.
Yeah.
Or they'd be like, oh, okay, well, we're going to open source this part of the project anyways, so I'm okay showing this to you. So that also kind of restricted things. So I think like, it took a long time. I had help. Sometimes I would get kind of restricted views. Definitely folks in like the climate science realm that I was working with were much more like, more of them were academics. They're like, oh yes, like come talk to me about my stuff. But yeah, journalists are definitely like a bit that I think you need to like develop trust with. And then like, there's always the flip side of like, we're trying to build tools that you could use to solve your problems. Right. Every prototype I've had, I've just been like, sharing it first with people who participated in that study and follow my work and trying to get their early feedback on stuff. Flip side of that is like, giving people a new tool is like still giving them a lot of work. Like sometimes we think like, I will give you a tool and like, it will be like so much better for you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And it's like, they're like, thanks, like I didn't really ask for this. Like, so I think that's the flip side too, is you realize that with actual like system building and tool adoption, it's like you got to provide support for that in a long-term way. But this is all kind of leading towards, actually one of the participants of that study reached out to me, 2 years after the fact and was like, hey, we're trying to do this story. And we're trying to publish it in 3 months. And we are looking for someone who has like front-end expertise, can do some cloud infrastructure, can do like data visualization stuff and cartography. We're like the only person
in the world.
Not in the world, definitely not. There's a lot of those folks in my little like corner, but yeah, and that ended up being like honestly one of the best experiences that I had recently. And it was like from kind of establishing that trust and getting referrals and stuff that like collaborations like that became possible. And then like, with that project, I was basically just like, I'm not trying to do research. I'm just trying to like be here full time, being a member of this team.
Yeah.
So for that, I didn't do like any IRB. I'll never like publish about that experience, but it also totally like deepened and changed everything I'd learned from that first study. And this is where I'm like, oh, there's something really different that you get by being in the work with someone for 3 months than you do by observing them for an hour and a half. And I really think that like more of us should be trying to do that. It's really hard to publish research and do like long-term collaborations like that. So I think like really I understand the restrictions. And for me, I happen to be in a good situation where my advisor is like, yes, go do this, learn what you can. Let's bring back what you learn and fold it into kind of the next iteration on systems and on the contributions we want to make.
That's awesome. That's very cool.
Well, you have a hard stop.
Yes.
Right now.
Oh,
so
I've just been like rambling on.
It's been great. It's been great.
So sad. I feel like we haven't touched so much, but
yeah,
maybe part 2.
Part 2 later.
Part 2.
Do you have any?
I'm allowed now.
Do you have any parting advice for anyone out there who maybe is earlier in their career path than you? Or
yeah, I think like one thing I maybe want to reflect on is like coming back to grad school after like time away. I think we didn't touch on it too much, but I really think like taking some time before starting a PhD is really great. There's the practicalities of like making money and having savings that make living on a grad school stipend like more possible. Mm-hmm. I think, maybe you feel this way too, Connor, but I also feel like there's just some knowledge of like what the alternative to a PhD is. So it doesn't feel so like make or break every day. I kind of feel like I'm like choosing to be here. And I also feel like I have the flexibility to kind of like, reach out to folks and kind of think about like, what would going back to industry look like? What would kind of a mixed role where I'm like half in industry, half here kind of look like? Kind of just like opens up maybe your worldview and like takes some stress out of the whole like graduate school experience. So I'm a big proponent of like taking some time. Obviously, if you switch disciplines like I do, like I'm not sure that any geography Arabic undergrad is going to be able to apply to a CS PhD and get accepted. Like definitely it was that those 5.5 years in between ended up being like really important to kind of finding my way here. And even then it was really a fit with my advisor that made it possible. So it's definitely like a road I think folks should take. I think you can learn a lot from it, and kind of doing the dance between academia and industry is really cool.
Awesome.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you too. This is really fun. Yeah, I'm excited to check out the other ones in this series.